I am delighted to hand it over to our first host, Tessian's Head of Threat Intelligence, Paul Ladansky. Here's New Vulnerabilities, Ransomware, and Supply Chain Attacks. 3 lessons to make you rethink your inbound strategy. With guest speakers, Dave Kennedy, CEO and founder of TrustedSec, and Elvis Chan, Assistant Special Agent in Charge at the FBI.
Thank you, Stacia, and hello, everyone. I'm Paul Ladansky, Head of Threat Intelligence here at Tessian, and I'm delighted to welcome Dave Kennedy, founder of TrustedSec, and Elvis Chan, Assistant Special Agent in Charge at the FBI, to the virtual stage. Elvis and Dave, thanks for joining us today. Dave, starting with you, supply chain attacks need to be top of mind in 2022. What has monumental incidents like Log4j highlighted about these vulnerabilities?
I think when you look at all of the attack surfaces out there, we hear about ransomware every day, nation state attacks. One of the ones that definitely keeps me up at night is supply chain attacks. And that's because it's taking advantage of, third party trusted suppliers of our software, our code, of our infrastructure, of our cloud infrastructure. I mean, everything runs off of software development companies. We don't just build our own operating systems. We don't just build our own, phone platforms. And all of these are susceptible avenues for attackers. We saw with NotPetya was kind of the monumental one that we saw where the Russian intelligence agencies hacked into the Ukrainian tax software, pushed out updates that caused ransomware. I think it caused over $100 million worth of damages in FedEx in under 20 minutes. We saw the damages there, and then we saw SolarWinds where they literally ripped into most of the large backbone technological companies. I mean, Cisco, Microsoft, Intel, VMware, were all hit by these specific attacks. And it goes to show you how predominant and how invasive these types of attacks can be and hard to detect because of how we trust our third-party software update processes. You look at Log4j as an example of that. When we're embedding in third-party libraries into hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of software applications, these types of attacks are even harder to fix because they're embedded so much into the technology platforms that we use. I can honestly say, every single day that we're doing security assessments, we still run into Log4j in almost every single organization that we go into. So these types of attacks are going to be around for a while. And it's one of those ones where, when you're starting to look at how these attacks occur, we saw ransomware groups taking advantage of Kaseya recently, a third-party managed service provider, where they targeted one to, hundreds, thousands of customers. Those are going to be the next fronts of attack, from ransomware groups. It makes a lot of sense. Why go after one individual victim when you can target 1,000 victims and get a much larger payday from these companies and organizations? So, we have a lot of different threat models that are kind of coming into play here with supply chain attacks. And it's honestly one of the most devastating, the hardest to detect, and ones that we aren't designed for in our infrastructure to actually protect against because we trust our third parties. And that's just how it's always been.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've seen organizations just scrambling when this first came out to try and find where these third-party libraries were being used and deployed. So that was definitely a good one, a good highlight. Elvis, what are you seeing from the law enforcement side of things that you'd be able to share with us?
So I completely agree with everything that David said, and he didn't even owe me a cup of coffee for that. So we're seeing the exact same thing. And so I'm here at FBI San Francisco, and we're the lead investigative office for the SolarWinds breach. So you can imagine, I can't talk specifically about that investigation, but what that case and other significant breaches have taught me from a law enforcement angle is that we need to go to zero trust architecture, right? And so right now, I think companies are definitely moving and everyone's advertising. So it's still not super defined. Like NIST has tried to come out. There's a white paper, it's 800-207, but we're still trying to figure it out, right? So I think if we as a community can figure out a good framework for what we want zero trust to look like, and then agree on that framework and then push it out. I know a lot of people aren't agreeing. They're just pushing out zero trust right now. But definitely, I think that is the wave of the future.
Yeah, for sure. Dave, what do you think the broader outcomes are for the security world?
Well, to hit on the zero trust aspect of things, I think as a philosophy and principle, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're trying to minimize the ports and protocols and services that you traditionally would have from an attack surface perspective. And you're also saying, okay, let's minimize our impact if something were to become compromised or breached, essentially microsegmentation or segmentation as a whole. And so you're getting more towards the ability of these types of breaches. And where you see most amount of damages occur out there is really around the lateral movement component of things, where one specific system becomes compromised and they're able to leverage that initial foothold into other areas of the network and access sensitive systems, intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's why, you look at the social engineering aspects of things, of the phishing campaigns, and why that's always been, so successful. You target Bob and Sales, and Bob and Sales doesn't have all the keys to the kingdom or intellectual property, but that's through the castle doors inside the castle now, and all of a sudden you can start moving to these different parts of your network that now have all that intellectual property and data. So the major breaches are due to the ability to spread across infrastructure and architecture, and that, from a ransomware perspective, whether that's backups, your SQL databases, your domain administrator accounts or domain controllers. The more access that these attackers have, the more damage that you see specifically around ransomware. And same thing from nation state attacks or organized crime groups. It's that spread aspect that makes things all this possible. The good news on cybersecurity strategy is that I think we're focusing on the right things. You look at 10 years ago when I was in this industry. I've been in it for over 20 years. 10 years ago, we'd go into organizations and they were super focused myopically on fixing technical findings, whereas today most organizations recognize, hey, we're going to have vulnerabilities and exposures that put us at risk, whether that's through social engineering or phishing, or whether that's through a patch that we forgot about, or hey, we didn't identify this log4j issue in one of our custom applications that we identified, and now attacker has access. How do we minimize the damage to our organization? How do we shelter off these systems from an architecture perspective? How do we identify what attack footprints look like in our infrastructure and respond to these to minimize the damage? So we're having the right conversations around how to shut these types of attacks down, regardless of sophistication level. It's just a matter of implementing them in very complex, legacy systems, really complex, organizations, businesses that have to really redesign and innovate their infrastructure and architecture and update it to more today's standards. So that's the big challenge. Is it's a complex problem that isn't going to be fixed overnight. And there's no like magic solution or magic piece of software you're going to install. Just really hard work, effort, kind of changing the business, changing the technology, changing how you look at things, and trying to minimize your damage and approach to these types of attacks.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I know 10, 20 years ago, security was a function, but as time has moved on, security has just been embraced by whole organizations from C-suite down through the rest of the organization. It's so important for everybody, I think, now to be part of the security culture. So we've seen ransomware groups flocking to exploit the vulnerability. Why are these perfect conditions for ransomware groups to strike?
So right now, I think there's two things going on. Number one is COVID, right? Like, God, we're at the 2-year milestone of COVID and it's still happening. So what does COVID actually mean? It means a lot of us are teleworking more than ever, right? And so when we're teleworking, that means we're working from home and we're working from a home wireless router. So there are vulnerabilities, as both of you know, and hopefully your audience knows as well, right? Like one of the things I see is a lot of people use the default password on their wireless router. So that's like one of the big issues that I see. If I can give you one homework assignment, it's to figure out how to change your password and use a complicated one. Or maybe even better, get a password manager, right? So that's number one. Number two, what we have seen exponential growth in is ransomware as a service. So in the old days, so ransomware itself, it's more complicated than you think it is, right? So someone has to develop the ransomware. They have to recompile it and keep changing it up so that it will evade firewalls and antivirus, right? So that's one group, the developers. Then there's the ones who actually speak and write English well enough so that they can, either send the ransom letters or do the negotiations, if they're on Skype or whatever medium. And then there's the getting the ransom part, right? So you have to have a money mule network. You have to have, like services, like money laundering services, they're called mixers and tumblers in the business. But like there's this ecosystem and it requires like large criminal syndicates. And that's what the FBI is good at. We're good at going after big players, even if they're spread across lots of countries. And what we hadn't intended is this thing called ransomware as a service, which is similar to like if you have a fast food restaurant, I won't name any of them specifically, but if you want to get a piece of the action, you pay a franchise fee and then guess what? You get all of the branded stuff from that fast food restaurant, right? So, and so, we're the lead office for Darkseid Ransomware, which, I think some of was responsible for the Colonial Pipeline hack. So we don't think it was Darkseid, the main syndicate. We believe it was an affiliate. So someone who paid the franchise fee got access to a control panel and all of the infrastructure and was off to the races. And so the problem with being able to franchise out is you used to need like large, groups of people. Now you can literally be, a knucklehead 16-year-old. If you can pull together the franchise fee or, it's the affiliate fee, you're off to the races. And that has been the problem. And we've seen a lot of these knuckleheads really being indiscriminate in who they're targeting. And, like Colonial Pipeline is just one of them, but JBS, right? Like things that, no offense to these companies, I'd never heard of, but like they're responsible for, 40% of the meat distribution on the West Coast or 40% of the oil distribution on the East Coast. It's these kinds of things that smarter, more organized groups would not go after because the sweet spot is staying under the radar and not making the front page of the New York Times. But when you do that, then obviously you get the full attention of the FBI. And you can see that we've had a lot of law enforcement actions, and I'm predicting a lot more law enforcement actions because we have a lot of active investigations. In fact, we have over 100 investigations on all the different variants of ransomware. So just keep looking for big splashy takedowns from the FBI.
Well, definitely. Thank you for the work that you and the FBI are doing in this.
Thanks.
One thing to note on that too is it's been awesome to see some of these groups actually taken down, right? Actual, raids occurring via Europol and joint efforts between the FBI. There's been a lot of raids on these various groups and again, affiliates, people that are actually running the groups themselves. So I think there's been a lot more pressure put onto these ransomware groups over the past. And I really think that's going to be, key to knocking these groups down. The only issue that you typically see is, you knock one of these groups down and then, 10 other followers then kind of spurn up and spawn off of that, and they start their own groups, or a lesser sophisticated one now gets more funding and backing, and they start to develop their capabilities. So I don't envy your job of what you're doing day in and day out, but at the end of the day, getting more of these folks off of the streets, I think, is the most important aspect around this, and being hard on these groups so they do shut down.
No, I appreciate that, David. I agree with you. I mean, it's a continuing cat and mouse game, right? I think one of the differences that you've seen is we don't necessarily, like in the old days, we would arrest the people and then seize the funds like all in one fell swoop. Nowadays, right, especially taking advantage of blockchain technology, if we can seize back the funds, even if we don't have handcuffs on the subjects yet, then we're going to do it, right? And I mean, you saw our New York office, I mean, they just had that massive seizure, right? Like over $2 billion. And those people weren't even the hackers. They're just one of the money laundering groups, right? And so,
did you see the rap videos for those?
Oh my God, yeah, the wife, yeah, ugh, like but like you can see, like in the old days, we would just leave them in the wind and then swoop in eventually, and it could be a year or two from now. But now, like we're trying to cause as much mayhem and disruption as we can because I mean there's billions of dollars of losses globally every year. So I mean this is definitely a paradigm shift for the FBI and all of our international law enforcement partners.
Well, this is a very interesting discussion for sure. And speaking of ransomware, I mean, clearly it's a sustained threat to businesses. Why do phishing emails remain the delivery mechanism of choice for it?
I think when you look at phishing campaigns, that's the easiest method, right? When you look at perimeter defenses, organizations, kind of consider themselves probably like the M&M syndrome, where they're hard on the outside, soft on the inside. And when you look at that, it's you have to do a lot of research to do reconnaissance against an organization's external perimeter. Potentially find a flaw or missing patch, and the ability to get things like remote code execution takes time to go after systems. So there's a lot of time investment in that, right? Whereas if you're targeting an individual company, and maybe you're doing targeted attacks against individuals through open source intelligence gathering. I mean, you can craft a pretext and attack in a day. Your infrastructure is already probably predominantly automated, and you start to send out your weaponization of tooling and everything else that goes around there. You're looking at maybe a couple of days of investment of time to compromise an organization versus weeks or months that it would take. It's the same thing on the 0-day angle. Microsoft, Apple, Linux have put so much preventative mechanisms in remote code execution type of flaws that it's very expensive. And same thing for mobile devices. It's very expensive, and you need a high level of sophistication to be able to exploit those types of vulnerabilities to go the 0-day angle. Whereas 15 years ago, 0 days were flying off of was flying off the shelves. So I think it's the bar of entry. Lower sophisticated groups can leverage phishing, especially if they're using ransomware as a service type areas where the weaponization and tooling, the command and control has already been designed for them. It's already designed to evade EDRs or antivirus products or things to that effect, and then they can land themselves on the systems. In these groups, you look at I know some of the documents were leaked from Revil and a few other ones where you can see how they actually operate within an organization. They have walkthroughs and guidelines of how you do lateral movement. What tools do you use? How do you run the encryptors? So they're very methodical in nature once they are already on the inside, and they have a lot of automation built around a lot of things that they do. So I think phishing is one of the easiest because it's a low bar of entry. It doesn't require a highly sophisticated hacker that is developing and weaponizing tools and things of that effect. But at the end of the day, it's just makes it a lot easier to go after the user versus trying to crack the perimeter.
I completely agree with David on this. And what I like to say is like, we're already talking about Web 3.0, right? But guess what? We're still on human being 1.0. And like in the FBI, like based on my experience, out of all of the cyber investigations we have, I would say 80% of them were able to access networks or devices through social engineering, through phishing, through text, like smishing, all of these things. 80% is still like like David said, it's the way to go, right? Like we're still the same human beings, and I would say our brains are probably more overloaded because we've each at least got 3 or 4 devices on our bodies. That's not even like the things in our house, right? Like you know i I've been guilty of this. I'm at home, I'm looking at my smartphone, I've got my iPad up, and I've got the TV on, and like my daughter's sitting on the couch next to me texting with their friends and doing the exact same thing. So we're distracted, and the criminals take advantage of this distraction. Like, oh, like I didn't pay attention, I clicked on a link I shouldn't have. I mean, I don't, but like other people do, right? And so the criminals can still take advantage of that.
And I'll add just a
I,
really quick 20-second story here on the distraction aspects of things. I was doing a social engineering campaign against an organization, and I phished a user, and this is obviously simulating a hacker going into an environment. And we phished a user, got their username and password, and I went to authenticate to their VPN concentrator with my username and password. And I didn't realize that they had multi-factor authentication in place, and it was already set to do what's called a push notification. So it sends a notification to your phone, and you have to hit approve or deny. And in that box that pops up, it'll say where your location is. So I was coming from Cleveland, Ohio, and this user was in like a different state all the way across the other side of the side of the house. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh man, I totally messed this whole fish up. I'm gonna have to tear down my infrastructure. I'm gonna have to rebuild everything again. I have to launch an attack against somebody else. My whole attack is burned. And I get up to use the bathroom, and I come back, and all of a sudden I'm logged into the VPN concentrator. The user had clicked approve because they thought they were logging in from somewhere else. So even the technology that we're used to, we get so accustomed to using it day in and day out, and so many distractions, as Elvis had mentioned, that we just get so confused. We're just like, oh, I'm sure I'm logging in from somewhere, and I just hit approve, even though it was an attacker at the time. So it's amazing to see those stories when you actually go and do it.
yeah, I totally agree. And in my experience in the past too, a lot of times when working with customers, I found that that's exactly what happened. They would get an email and they would go ahead and click on a link, or they would click on an attachment without any further thought. It was just that sweet spot of timing for a distraction that was just needed for the infiltration to take place. Okay,
Yep.
so how can we prevent ransomware earlier in the email cyber attack kill chain?
So, I mean, I guess I'll steal a little bit of David's thunder. For me, there's really two things, right? Is number one is to do exactly what you said. Like we're still a human being 1.0, so providing training to not be distracted, right? Like, and the problem, it's hard though, right? Like you do an infosec course like once a year. The good companies that I work with, they'll do it at least like on a monthly basis, right? And if you're on the naughty list, like a couple, 2 times, 2 months in a row, like there are ramifications, right? So I do think training is good. Um, but there are technology solutions. Like when the FBI switched to DMARC for our email, it was amazing. It reduced like the spam email I got by like 99%. So that was awesome. But the other thing that I see that companies do not do is having good backups. And I don't just mean online backups, I mean having cold storage, right? Like having some offline backup, because like I'll talk with companies, oh yeah, Elvis, we've got all of these backups of our most critical data. And then they go to restore from them and they've all been corrupted, right? All the new variants of ransomware look for your online backups and they jack them up, right? So if you don't have anything offline, you're completely hosed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and to
to
that
add to
point
what
too, it's
sorry.
oh, I was just going to add, yeah, to that point too, there's got to be some type of process where you're testing those backups that you
Yeah. Oh,
can go ahead and
absolutely. Yes.
recover. Yeah,
Yeah.
To
Practice
add
what you
what
preach.
Elvis was saying there, I think the backup strategy is important. I think also going back to the basics of things, education awareness, backups are important, but going into things like multi-factor authentication or not even allowing full VPN access into your environment and going more towards that zero trust model, right? Become more of a service provider, not providing everything to somebody. Interesting enough, Microsoft just released 22% of their Microsoft 365 or Office 365 customers use multi-factor authentication. So only 22% of Microsoft's users use multi-factor authentication. That's abysmal, in my opinion, in the grand scheme of where we should be. So if you're listening right now and you don't have multi-factor authentication on, close the browser and put multi-factor authentication on right now across your entire organization enterprise. Honestly, that alone, if you look at Jen from CISA, the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, Jen said that I think it was like 99.98% of the attacks that they saw could have been prevented by multi-factor authentication being appropriately applied, across their infrastructure. MFA is such a huge thing. But also, if you look at the three main ways that ransomware groups are going after you now, that it's what we call more of the trifecta approach of where they're going after your backups, they're going after stealing the data, and then auctioning that off from a ransomware perspective, and also hitting you with distributed denial of services. You need to build those into your threat models of how you protect against that. And I think Elvis hit right on there. It should definitely be centric around, hey, what is our backup and recovery strategy? Because that's going to be your most critical aspect. And then working inward, outward of saying, okay, what does an attack look like in our infrastructure? How do we minimize damage there? How do we look at it from a detection perspective and keep moving outward until you get a good defensible approach against these? Because they're not going away. And one of my leads on the incident response and threat hunting team over at TrustedSec recently said, listen, the capabilities of these ransomware groups are getting to the same level as nation states, from a research and development perspective, the weaponization of tooling. So they're not going away anytime soon, and they're only going to increase in sophistication because they are being so successful with this. So we need to do stuff now. We can't wait, a year, 2 years, 5 years. It's immediate action is needed to prevent these types of attacks.
yeah, completely agreed. So another question that I have is, why are attackers continuing to take advantage of employees and their access?
Well, because it's the soft underbelly, right? As David mentioned. Yeah, in my experience too, and I didn't know those numbers you cited, but yeah, in my experience, only about 20% of the companies that I deal with in the Silicon Valley, which you would hope would like have the highest level of technical sophistication, they use MFA, right? Most like so that means 80% of the companies, and I'll ask, right? I'll ask the CISO and I was like, hey, do you guys use MFA? He's like, I really want to, Elvis. That's on my list of things to do, but uh everyone's really against it, right? And in the US government, specifically in the FBI, it's been like 10 years now. I remember they sent us an email and said, we're switching to multi-factor authentication in 2 weeks. And then in 2 weeks, they switched us where we have to use RFID chips. And then, we have a little token that generates a PIN. And, and then we have a password that we have to change every 60 days, right? So 3 factors. It was a massive pain in the ass. People revolted, but guess what? You're in the federal government, so nobody cares about your feelings, right? But now it's like second nature. Like I don't even think about it now. And I would argue once people get over that initial friction, it would be fine. And yeah, like it's a lot harder, like David said, right? Like to have to use a 0 day so the 3 ways I see people getting in are like through social engineering, through unpatched but known vulnerabilities, and through 0 days. And I would say 0 days is like less than 1%, right? Because as David mentioned, so expensive. But like I do see a lot of times where, like Microsoft will push out a patch and then the bad guys will see, oh, that's the vulnerability. We're going to inject ransomware right into it, right? Because they know companies aren't going to be fast enough patching all of their stuff. But like those are the issues that we see and they continue. Like, man, I agree with David. If we could do one thing, it would be MFA for everyone.
Just to put
All
in
right.
perspective,
So,
I implemented multi-factor authentication as the chief security officer at Diebold, 25,000 employees in less than a month. So it's doable across a global, organization and company. Communication is key. Stage rollouts and making sure you address people's concerns, and then you roll it out and people get used to it. That's how it works. And MFA is one of the top ones right there for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely agreed with you. It all comes down to just starting to generate that muscle, right? And then as people start to use that muscle, it becomes a memory. And then to your point, right? It's just part of the process now. People can start doing it without any thought. So, with that said, Elvis and Dave, thank you so much for sharing your insight on these threats with us today. You've both had very fascinating vantage points on these issues, so we're grateful you can join us. I'll be handing back over to Stacia, who will take us on to our next station. Stay tuned.